Hi, my name's Josh and welcome to the video. Today we'll be taking a look at the Skullbreaker Ogryn from Darktide. So first let's answer the question, what is an Ogryn? An Ogryn is a subspecies of human that evolved on high gravity worlds. This somehow resulted in them growing to massive sizes, even though it doesn't really make sense, but they stand around 10 feet tall and weigh about a ton. However, despite this physical evolution, they mentally devolved to a point where the average Ogryn has the mental capacity of a small child. To give you an example, Nork Deadog was considered to be a genius among his kind because he was able to spell his name with an N and count to 4. But don't let their dim-wittedness fool you. They are doggedly loyal, and their strength and resilience make them a potent weapon. Now, the Ogryn was probably my least played character in the closed beta test, but not because they weren't fun to play, it was just because I wanted to test some of the other characters and play around with some of the guns since the Ogryn had a bit of a limited selection during that test. So with that said, let's have a look at some of the weapons that they did have access to. First up we had the club, which was a really good stagger tool. You're able to control hordes really well with this one. And it also had some good single target damage as well. Next we had the knives that they had access to. There were a few different variations of the knife, but generally it had good cleave and good single target damage and attacked relatively quickly, although you do want to be using the heavy attacks more frequently on the Ogryn, which we'll get into shortly. On their ranged weapon side of things, they had the kickback single fire shotgun, so that's the shotgun that just fires a single slug out from it. It did a okay amount of damage on armoured targets, but I felt its real purpose was more of a crowd control option. If you shot it into an armoured target, it would basically knock them on their ass and force them to be stunned for a good while. So it's just a good control sort of weapon, not necessarily something that you want to be actively dealing damage with. That's where your melee weapons come in. And I also had access to the Ripper gun, which, from what I saw, had two different variants. The first one on the left click would just fire a double shot, and when you held down the right click, you would enter a stance where you hold onto the gun, and it would start firing in 3-round bursts. And on the second variant, the left click would just fire a 3-round burst, with a fair bit of kickback as well. And then when you entered the firing stance by holding down right click, it would go full auto and you could just start blasting away with that, so that was a lot of fun to use. We were also shown some recent gameplay footage from the class trailer for the Skullbreaker Ogryn, which showed us a few weapons that we didn't have access to during the closed beta, so I'll briefly touch on these. First we had the Power Maul, which was basically a one-handed mace that seems to function similar to the Zealot's Power Hammer, which can be empowered to deal extra damage for a single strike. We also had what appears to be a Power Maul and a Slab Shield, which adds some defensive capability. We also had a Combat Shovel, which seems to function similar to the Veteran's Combat Shovel. A Grenade Launcher, which was a bit similar to the Kickback Shotgun that we went over earlier, but shoots out a grenade instead. And lastly, we have the Grenadier Gauntlets, which are shown to be the unique weapon for the Ogryn in the character creator screen. I have a theory that this weapon may function differently to the other weapons because all of the Ogryn's weapons are actually unique to him. No other character can use the Ogryn's weapons, and the Ogryn can't use any other character's weapons as well. So I believe the Grenadier Gauntlets will actually occupy both the melee slot and the range slot, and you'll be able to swap between two separate modes, basically a melee mode and a ranged firing mode. My main reason for thinking this is that every other character has two unique weapons displayed in their character creation screen, while the Ogryn only has this weapon displayed. In addition, we are clearly shown in that gameplay clip that the Grenadier Gauntlets are being used to punch the enemy with, but I could be dead wrong on this. That might just be the special attack button similar to the bayonet stab or the bash with the kickback shotgun. And let me know what you think about this theory in the comments as well. Now let's move on to the base kit for the Ogryn. First we have their Blitz ability, Grenade Box, throwing an entire box of grenades with high strength and enthusiasm, single target, high damage attack. So this one's actually pretty hilarious to use in game since you're basically just yeeting a box at the enemy. As the text says, it does deal a high amount of damage, but you do only get one use with it, so you're usually just saving it for one of the big targets like a Crusher or a Plague Ogryn, or maybe one of the mauler enemies. It does knock them over as well, which is handy, but again, just that single use can make it a little bit tough. Next up, we have their Aura ability, Intimidating Presence. This gives plus 10% heavy melee attack damage to allies with Incoherency. Then we have their active ability, Bull Rush, Ferocious Charge. So the text doesn't give us much to go off of, but it's basically a charge forward that knocks enemies out of your way. If you're familiar with Footnight Kruber from Vermintide 2, it's basically a one-to-one translation of that. Next, we have their 3 iconic abilities. The first one is Thick Skin, which gives plus 20% toughness damage reduction and plus 20% health damage reduction. So this basically just helps make the Ogryn a bit tankier. We then have the next iconic ability, Excessive Force, which gives plus 25% melee stagger. This is great for just being able to control the horde, and it can also help with staggering the bigger enemies and knocking them around a bit, just to make them a lesser threat. And the third iconic ability is Loyal Protector. Being damaged while reviving or assisting allies no longer interrupts you. So this is pretty handy for those clutch moments where you just really need to get one of your downed allies back up on their feet. There's also another part of their kit which isn't shown here, but I should touch on it. They actually have an increased health pool in comparison to the other characters. Most characters have either 150 or 200 health in the Zealot's case, but the Ogryn actually has 300 health. But they still have the standard 100 toughness just like the others, with the exception of Veteran who has 200 instead. This increased total health actually comes with another benefit. They have an additional health bar segment, which means that they can actually survive being downed an additional time in comparison to the other characters, so this may actually make the Ogryn a great beginner class to learn the game with. Alright, now that we've gone over the base kit, let's get into some of the adjustable feats. So there are 6 columns of feats. These columns are unlocked every 5 levels, and within each column you have 3 feat options. You can change your feat options at any time outside of a match. So for the first column we have Linchpin, which gives plus 100% toughness replenishment, allies Incoherency. Next we have Smash 'em Good, replenish 15% toughness on single enemy heavy melee hit. And lastly, Best Form of Defense, replenish 15% toughness on hitting multiple enemies with a single heavy melee attack. So Smash 'em Good and Best Form of Defense are fairly straightforward. One is focused on single target heavy attacks and the other is focused on attacking multiple enemies with a single heavy attack. So your option there is fairly weapon dependent. As for Linchpin, this one's a bit of an interesting one since the wording is a little bit unclear. I believe the plus 100% toughness replenishment would apply to yourself, but it's questionable whether or not that does apply to your allies as well. Based on the wording, it seems it would, which would mean it's a good team pick as well. Next, we'll move on to the second column. First we have Heavyweight. This gives plus 50% damage against Bulwarks, Crushers, Plague Ogryns, and Reapers, and plus 50% damage reduction to those same enemies. We also have Bombs Away. Hitting a carapace armoured enemy with your grenade box causes it to open, releasing grenades around the target, and Blood and Thunder, which gives plus 1 bleed stack on heavy melee hits. So for Heavyweight, if you're not familiar with the enemies mentioned in that feat, we have the Bulwarks, which are the shielded Ogryn enemies. We have the Crushers, which are the big armoured Ogryn enemies. We also have the Plague Ogryn, which is the boss monster. And there's also the Reapers, which are the Ogryn enemies that carry around miniguns and blast at you from a distance. So this feat in general is quite solid, since you'll be able to deal additional damage to those elite and monstrous enemies, while also reducing the damage that you'll take, so that's always a good benefit. As for Bombs Away, this one's a little bit niche, since it does have to hit a carapace armoured enemy. So, from my understanding, those would include the Crushers, the Bulwark, and also the Mauler enemy types. And since the Ogryn only gets a single grenade use, this does seem a bit limited, but that's just my personal preference as well, since I usually prefer using feats that have a bit more of a general use and come up a lot in the moment-to-moment gameplay. But let me know in the comments what you guys think about this one. And also to touch on Blood and Thunder from that column, this one's really going to depend on how much damage those bleed stacks are actually doing. Next we have the level 15 column, which is usually based around teamwork feats. The first feat in that column is Towering Presence. This gives plus 50% coherency radius. Then we have Lead the Charge. When you activate Bull Rush, allies in coherency gain plus 25% movement speed for 4 seconds. And lastly, That's What Friends Are For. 50% of the damage taken by the closest ally in coherency is transferred to you. This talent has no effect while you're below 25% health. So for this column, Towering Presence seems to be a good general pick. I don't think you can go wrong with that one. Lead the Charge is another really niche pick. I'm just not too sure how the additional movement speed would stack up in comparison to the other feats that we have on this row. And for the last one, That's What Friends Are For. I initially didn't like this one when I initially read through it, but the more I thought about it, the more I came to the conclusion that I think there needs to be more testing done to figure out how the damage calculation works. First, we need to find out if it applies to all damage taken by your allies or if it's just health damage. We would also need to test if the innate damage reduction that the Ogryn has would reduce this transferred damage. And another situation that would need to be tested is if an ally takes purple health damage from a flame-based attack, if that purple damage gets transferred to you. If it does, that's definitely not ideal, but if it doesn't, that could actually be quite good because you're overall reducing the purple damage that your team's taking. Next, we'll move on to the level 20 feats. First we have Bullfighter, which gives plus 10% Bull Rush cooldown when you or an ally in coherency kills an elite enemy. Then we have Hard as Nails, which gives a minus 20% damage taken for each ally currently knocked down or incapacitated. And lastly, Die Hard, which gives plus 100% toughness replenishment while below 25% health. So I think from this column, Bullfighter is a fairly solid pick since it'll be coming up quite frequently. The other two are very situational, so Hard as Nails, the reduced damage taken while your allies are downed. This one could come in clutch from time to time since it does synergize well with the Ogryn's iconic ability Loyal Protector, where being damaged while reviving or assisting allies no longer interrupts you. So taking reduced damage while you're actually reviving your allies could be very helpful in that situation. And as for Die Hard, this one would be handy if you do find yourself falling below 25% health quite frequently, but if not, I'd be more inclined to suggest Bullfighter over the other feats shown here. Now for the level 25 column, we have Payback Time. When an enemy damages you, gain plus 20% against enemies of the same type for 5 seconds. Knife Through Butter, fully charged heavy attacks have unlimited cleave. And Raging Bull, plus 10% damage next melee hit on melee hit for each enemy hit with the initial attack. Alright, so I've got a few things for these ones. Firstly, for Payback Time, it doesn't actually mention what the plus 20% is for. I think it's safe to assume it's damage, so basically you take a hit and then you deal an additional 20% damage against enemies of the same type. So that one's fine, that's fairly straightforward. Now, Knife Through Butter is a bit of an odd one since it will actually change your moment-to-moment gameplay. Usually when you go to do a heavy attack, you want to release it as soon as the wind-up animation is completed, and then keep swinging backwards and forwards with a good momentum. This would instead want you to hold it down all the way and continue charging until it automatically releases at the end. There's a few weapons in Vermintide 2 that function this way, like the Executioner Sword, the War Pick for the Dwarf, and I believe Saltspire's Rapier also has a similar effect, where if you charge up the heavy attack, it deals additional damage. But the Unlimited Cleave is interesting for this one, since you'll be able to just fully clean through hordes. So that could be an interesting pick, but it might not necessarily be safe, since you're usually quite vulnerable while you're charging up your heavy attacks. And last but not least on this column, Raging Bull. This one's really solid in my opinion, since you're at the minimum getting a plus 10% damage boost all the time, but the wording is a little bit janky on this one, so let me explain just in case it didn't make sense to you. So whenever you hit an enemy or multiple enemies, you get plus 10% damage per enemy hit on your next attack after that one. So again, at the very least, you're getting at least 10% damage all the time. If you're cleaving through multiple enemies, you're potentially getting more than 10% on your following strike. And now we've got the final column, which is all based around your active ability, Bull Rush, and will effectively change how it functions. So the first one, Bull Gore, this applies a +1 bleed stack on enemies hit by Bull Rush. Then we have Unstoppable, increases the distance you travel with Bull Rush by 100 meters, and you cannot be blocked by enemies except monstrosities. And lastly, Non-Stop Violence, replenish 10% toughness per Bull Rush hit. So just like Blood and Thunder, I think the power of Bull Gore is really going to depend on how much damage the bleed stacks do. As for Unstoppable, the 100 meters distance is very far. You'll basically be able to cover the distance of nearly any room that you encounter, and being able to rush through all enemies except monstrosities is really handy. Now, as for that wording, monstrosities, I believe that refers to the boss enemies like the Plague Ogryn. And just as a side note, considering it does say monstrosities and not specifying Plague Ogryn, I think that does imply that there are going to be other bosses aside from the Plague Ogryn itself. But that aside, this does seem to be a very solid feat, and I think it would be very helpful for saving allies that are a bit out of position and have kind of walked off from the team a little bit. That way you can quickly rush to where they are, knock all the enemies out of the way, and try and get them back up nice and quickly. And for the last option, Non-Stop Violence, I think this one's a really good general pick, and depending on your positioning, I think it'll be really helpful for rushing down those pesky shooting enemies. That way you can knock for a few enemies on the way there and just eat up a few shots while getting some toughness back. Alright, so what are the takeaways from all this? So we can tell the Ogryn is an absolute physical powerhouse. He's a frontline specialist. He's able to deal a lot of damage to armoured elites. He can stagger very well, able to control the battlefield, and he can also soak a lot of damage himself since he has such a massive health pool. So to summarise, he is an absolute unit of a character. Now let's quickly go over a few builds that I've come up with for the Ogryn. The first one we have is the Bleed build, which focuses mainly around Blood and Thunder in the second column, and Bull Gore in the final column. I would be mainly picking the best form of defense from the first column, since you'd want to be focusing on hitting multiple enemies at a time to spread your bleed across as many enemies as possible. Then I believe the third row is very dependent on what you'd prefer. Again, in my opinion, Towering Presence is a good general pick. You can't really go wrong with that. As for the fourth column, I think Bullfighter would be really solid, since you're able to get your Bull Rush back more frequently, which in turn means that Bull Gore will be activating as well. And Knife Through Butter could also be a very interesting pick for this build, since being able to have unlimited cleave would mean that you could spread your bleeds very quickly. So the second build I came up with is the Tank build. The first column is very dependent on the weapon you'd prefer, but I would actually suggest Smash 'em Good, since if you pick a weapon that has a single target overhead, you can ensure that you'll be getting consistent toughness back, even if you're not getting the kills, since you only need to hit the enemy for this to trigger. From the second column, I'd go with Heavyweight, since the increased damage against Bulwarks, Crushers, Plague Ogryns and Reapers is handy, but also the damage reduction from those sources is also very good for a tank. From the third column, I would be going with That's What Friends Are For. Again, this one still needs some testing to figure out how it works exactly, but it could be quite good if it does potentially mitigate damage from your teammates. And from the fourth column, Die Hard, which gives the increased toughness replenishment while below 25% health. So this one actually synergizes with That's What Friends Are For, since you'll eventually get reduced below 25% health from absorbing your teammates' damage. And then once you're in that state, you'll have that increased survivability by regaining increased toughness, not just from your kills, but also from your hits with the single target overheads mentioned earlier. From the 5th column, I would personally go with Raging Bull for the consistent increased damage, but there may actually be a possible synergy with Payback Time, and That's What Friends Are For, since it's possible that the absorbed damage from your teammates actually triggers Payback Time, but that's another thing that would need to be tested. And for the last column, Non-Stop Violence will likely be your best pick, since consistently being able to get toughness back from your active ability will be really handy, especially when you're absorbing damage from your teammates. Now my third build is a little bit of a goofy one. It all works off of the assumption that Linchpin from the first column does in fact work for your teammates as well, effectively increasing their own toughness regeneration. So I call this one the Walking Battery. So of course in the first column we'd be picking Linchpin. Then from the second column it's really personal choice, but I'd probably go with Heavyweight. From the third column you would want to pick Towering Presence to increase your coherency radius even further. And for the 4th column, this one's also very much personal preference, but I think Hard as Nails would be a really solid pick, since it'll help you with getting up your teammates when they're downed, and we're really going for a support type character for this build. For the 5th column, I would be going with Raging Bull once again, since the consistent damage increase is always solid. And for the final column, I believe Unstoppable would be your best pick with this build, since we're going for a really support character. Being able to immediately dash to any teammates that have gone down while out of position, knocking all the enemies away and being able to get them up a lot easier is going to be probably the best pick for this type of build. Alright, and the last one that I've come up with is a solid beginner build for anyone that might be struggling with Darktide in general, or with the Ogryn specifically. So in the first column, we'd be wanting to go with the best form of defense, which gives increased toughness back when hitting multiple enemies. So you'll really want to focus on using a weapon with a good amount of cleave so you can just keep chopping through those hordes. In the next column, we'd want to go with Heavyweight. That way we're increasing your damage output against some of the bigger, meaner enemies in the game, but also reducing the damage that you take, since I know a lot of new players struggle when fighting against boss enemies. In the third column, Towering Presence is going to be your best pick, since it's a good general option that's always going to be applying to you, and getting the coherency bonuses from your allies as well will also be helpful. In addition, I don't think Lead the Charge would be very helpful, and That's What Friends Is For is probably going to end up frustrating new players more than anything else, so I would really suggest sticking with Towering Presence. In the 4th column, Bullfighter is a really solid option, since you'll be able to consistently get your ultimate back quite quickly, but I would say the other options there can also be quite helpful. Again, Die Hard's a good pick if you find yourself falling on low health quite consistently, and Hard as Nails is good for those really niche situations, but as a good general pick, Bullfighter's probably the way to go. In the 5th column, Raging Bull I think is just probably one of the best talents in that row. It's just a good, consistent damage increase. And for the final column, I'd be going with Non-Stop Violence once again. This one's just good for helping with survivability, since you can use your Bull Rush quite frequently, and the extra toughness regained this way is going to be really helpful for newer players, since they might be still learning how to defend themselves correctly. Alright, that covers my overview for the Ogryn Skullbreaker. In the next video, we'll be taking a look at the Zealot Preacher. But before I finish the video, I did want to leave you with a quote that I think really encapsulates the spirit of the Ogryn.
Love me Emperor, love me rations, love me stickers, hate traitors, hate Xenos, I'm not racist, I just don't like them, hate heretics, simple as.
Thanks for watching the video guys, remember to like, comment and subscribe, it really helps since I'm a new channel. And I'll see you in the next video. Take it easy.